The night was cold on planet Eltera 5. The wind blew fine red sand across the rocky hills, and most humans had locked their doors early. But James Riker, a retired human engineer, was still awake, sitting beside the fireplace in his small cabin. He lived alone, just the way he liked it until he heard the knocking. It was soft, slow, and full of hesitation. He stood up, confused, looking toward the metal door. Who would be knocking at this hour? On this side of the settlement. He walked over, placed his hand on the scanner, and the door creaked open. Outside stood an alien woman, her head slightly bowed. Her skin was pale lavender. Her clothes torn and dust-covered. But what caught James's eyes were the two small children behind her. They were clutching her legs, looking up with big golden eyes filled with fear. The woman didn't speak for a moment. Then, in a soft voice that shook with cold and shame, she said, "Please. We have nowhere else to go. We won't be trouble." James didn't move. His first instinct was caution. Many aliens were harmless, but the settlement had rules. Rules against taking in undocumented outsiders, especially alien widows. Still, he could see it clearly. The woman was exhausted, her children were shivering. They had no bags, no shelter, and from the looks of it, no food. James looked behind her. There was no vehicle, no cart, no supplies. Only footprints in the sand, which told him they had walked far. "Who are you?" he asked finally, his voice firm but not unkind. "My name is Riala," she whispered. I lost my husband. We were told humans had work, food, maybe kindness." Her voice cracked. "We just need a place to rest. Just tonight." James sighed. He was not a hero. Not anymore. He had left war and politics behind. But something in Riala's voice, something raw and broken, touched the part of him he thought was long gone. "Come in," he said quietly. Stepping aside, Riala looked shocked. Like she had expected rejection, she guided her children into the warm cabin. Keeping her eyes low, the children didn't speak, only stared at the wooden floor, their small frames shaking under thin clothes. James closed the door and threw an extra log into the fire. He pointed to a corner with a blanket. "You can rest there. It's not much, but it's warm." "Thank you," Riala said, bowing deeply. She led her children to the corner and sat down with them, curling up like a shield around them. James walked to the kitchen and returned with a metal tray. "Here, food," he said simply. Placing it near them, the children looked at Riala for permission. She nodded softly, and they reached for the bread and warm broth like it was treasure. Riala didn't eat. "Aren't you hungry?" James asked, sitting back in his chair. "I ate yesterday," she replied quickly, her tone defensive. He knew that was a lie, but he didn't press it. Silence filled the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire and soft chewing. James watched them closely. No sudden moves, no tricks. They were just scared, tired, and broken. When the children fell asleep beside her, Riala finally looked up at James. "I will leave tomorrow," she said. "We just needed one night. I promise I won't cause problems." James leaned forward, his voice calm but serious. "You didn't walk here in one night. Where were you before this?" Riala's face darkened. Her eyes dropped again. "Before this, we were in Sector 9. Working in the scrap fields, but they stopped paying us, and then they started hurting the children." James clenched his jaw. He had heard rumors, legal alien labor camps in the outer zones. But this was the first time he was seeing the aftermath. "No one helped you?" He asked. "No." Riala said softly. "No one ever helps us, not unless we pay or beg." James stood up and walked toward the window, looking out into the night. He knew the settlement leaders would be angry if they found out he took her in, but something inside him refused to turn them away. "You don't have to leave tomorrow," he said finally. "You and the kids can stay until you figure something out." Riala stared at him in disbelief. "But why?" she asked, Almost too afraid to hope, James shrugged. I've got space. And I don't like bullies. She lowered her head again and whispered, Thank you, human, as James returned to his chair, watching the fire dance in the hearth. He knew this night had changed something. He didn't know what Riala had gone through, or what danger she still carried. But he knew one thing: he couldn't look away anymore. And outside, in the shadows beyond the rocky hills, something else watched. The past Riala had run from wasn't far behind. The next morning, James woke to the smell of something cooking. He blinked, confused. He lived alone for so long that his cabin never smelled like food unless he made it himself. He got out of bed, grabbed his old jacket, and stepped into the main room. What he saw made him freeze. Riala stood in the small kitchen, her back turned to him. Her hair was tied with a strip of cloth, and her arms moved quickly as she stirred something in the pot. Steam rose, mixing with the smell of herbs and broth. Beside her, her daughter silently cleaned the table, wiping each corner like it was sacred. Her younger son was outside, sweeping the dusty porch, using a broken broom handle like it was his most important job. James rubbed the back of his neck, feeling awkward. He had never asked them to do any of this. You didn't have to, he said from behind her. His voice still rough with sleep. Riala turned quickly, eyes wide. I'm sorry, she said, lowering her gaze. I just thought it would help. James sat down slowly, watching her. She poured him a bowl of the soup she made and placed it in front of him. Then she stepped back, standing like a servant, waiting for orders. Sit down, James said, motioning to the seat across the table. You cooked, you eat too. She hesitated, then nodded and sat. But she didn't touch her food until he took the first spoonful. It was better than anything he'd made in weeks. Simple but warm, flavorful and comforting. After breakfast, Riala got to work again. She fixed the broken curtain in his room, washed the old sheets by hand, and even mended a torn coat James had given up on. She did it all without a word of complaint. No rest, no questions. Just quiet movement, like she was invisible. James watched this from his workbench. Something wasn't right. She was trying too hard, moving like someone who was afraid of being kicked out at any second. Later that day, he called her over. Riala, come sit, he said firmly. I need to ask you something. She sat down slowly, hands folded in her lap. Why are you working so hard? He asked gently. I said you could stay. I didn't mean you had to become my maid. Her lips trembled, but she kept her head down. I don't want to be a burden, she whispered. I want to earn my place, even if just for one more day. James leaned back, sighing. This isn't a trade, he said. You don't need to clean everything to prove you deserve shelter. I do, she said quickly, finally meeting his eyes. Because if I don't, someone might say we're useless, that we should be thrown out. James stared at her, and then understood. She had probably been tossed from place to place before, treated like dirt, expected to serve without rest. Has anyone ever treated you kindly without expecting something back? He asked. Riala didn't answer, but the silence spoke loud enough. That night, James left to gather supplies from town. When he returned, the cabin was spotless, the fire was lit, and food was already waiting. But something caught his attention. Riala had bandaged her hand, hiding it behind her robe. What happened? He asked sharply. Nothing, she said quickly. Just a small cut from the old water pump. James took a look anyway. The wound was deeper than she admitted. She had been bleeding for hours and didn't say a word. You need to tell me when you're hurt, he said firmly, wrapping her hand carefully. You don't need to suffer in silence just to prove anything. She looked at him, unsure of what to say. You're the first one who ever bandaged my hand, she said quietly. James looked away, not knowing what to say. Something in his chest ached. He didn't know her full story yet, but every time she looked surprised by kindness, it made him feel like her world had never been kind before. Later that night, the children sat by the fire, laughing softly for the first time. James gave them a small toy from his workshop, a wooden ship that lit up when you turned the dial. They gasped like it was treasure. Riala watched from the corner, smiling but holding back tears. She didn't cry loudly, she never did, but James saw her shoulders shake just a little. He didn't say anything. Instead, he brought her a hot drink and placed a blanket around her. "You don't have to prove anything," he said softly. "You're safe here, you and your children." That night, for the first time, Riala didn't sleep in the corner. She slept beside her children, on a real bed James had prepared for them. And James, he didn't know why, stood at the door, watching the stars for hours, because he had a feeling this peace wouldn't last long, and whatever Riala was running from might already be coming. The next morning, the sunlight fell gently over James's small cabin. Inside, everything felt peaceful. Riala was quietly brushing her daughter's hair while the little boy helped fold the blankets. James sipped his tea and watched them from his chair. A strange warmth had started to grow in his chest, the kind he hadn't felt in years. But peace never stayed long on El Taru 5. Especially not for those who didn't belong. By midday, a loud knock came at the door. It wasn't soft like Riala's knock. This one was hard and demanding. James opened it slowly, already guessing who it might be. 3 men stood outside, settlers from the nearby colony. At the front was Garen Holt, a loud man with a red face and no patience. Beside him were 2 others, their hands near their stun rifles. "Just in case." "Morning, Riker," Garen said with a fake smile. "Heard you had visitors." James stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "Not your business," he said calmly. Garen's smile dropped. "Come on, we're just concerned, you know how it is. We all agreed no stray aliens on private land." James crossed his arms. "She's not a stray. She's a mother who needed help. She's trouble." One of the men behind Garen growled. "They all are. They take, they lie. And they attract the wrong kind of attention." James didn't blink. "She's done nothing wrong." Garen leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You keep her here, and word will spread. Then more will come. Then the patrols will notice. You think they'll just ask questions? No. They'll burn everything, your cabin included." James clenched his jaw. "She's staying," he said firmly. Garen laughed once, shaking his head. "Suit yourself. But when it all goes wrong, don't come crying to us." The 3 men walked away, but not without throwing a final look at the house. A look that wasn't friendly. James went back inside and found Riala standing near the window. She had heard everything. Her shoulders were tense, her face pale. "I'll leave," she said softly. "I don't want them hurting you." James shook his head. "No, you stay. They don't get to decide what happens here, but they'll come back," she said, looking at him with tired eyes. "They always come back." James nodded slowly. "Then we'll be ready." That evening, James brought out his old defense tools: shock nets, signal jammers, and sensor drones. Riala helped him silently, but he could tell she felt guilty, as if all this trouble was her fault. The children didn't understand why the grown-ups seemed worried, but they stayed quiet, helping where they could. James handed the little boy a screwdriver and let him check the motion sensors. It made the child smile. And that was enough. The next day, things got worse. James went into town to buy supplies. As he walked through the open market, people stared at him. Some whispered, others stepped away. The butcher, who always joked with him, didn't even make eye contact. The mechanic overcharged him twice, then said, "You're lucky I'm still selling to you." When James asked why, the answer came with a sneer. "Because you took in a Fleerton alien widow. You think we want her kind spreading here?" James didn't reply. He paid and left, but anger burned in his chest. By the time he returned home, Ryla had already sensed something was wrong. She stood near the gate with her children behind her, watching the trail anxiously. When she saw him, she ran forward. "I was worried," she said. Out of breath, "I had a bad feeling." James gave her the supplies and a tired smile. "Your feeling was right," he said. "They're turning the town against us." She lowered her head, her voice full of guilt. "I'm sorry. You don't deserve this." James looked at her for a long moment, then said, "No one deserves this, not you.
Optics.
Not the kids, not me." That night, the wind blew harder. James sat outside with a rifle beside him. He didn't know if Garen and his friends would try anything, but he wasn't going to be caught off guard inside. Riala hummed a soft lullaby to the children. Her voice was shaky, but she still tried. James listened from the porch and felt something stir inside him, a deep ache he hadn't known in years. He had fought in wars, built cities, and lost people he loved. But nothing had prepared him for this. Not the fear in Riala's eyes. Not the innocence of the children. Not the weight of protecting someone who had already suffered so much. And just before midnight, he heard its footsteps. He stood quickly, gripping his weapon, but the sound faded before it reached the cabin. He scanned the area. Sensors showed nothing. Still, he knew the town wanted them gone, but James had made his choice. He was not letting them go. Not now, not ever. It started with a cough. Riala noticed it while brushing her son's hair. The boy coughed once, then again, a deep and dry sound that made her freeze. She pressed a hand to his forehead, too warm. Far too warm. She told herself it was just the cold wind. Just a little fever. But by evening, the child couldn't stand, his small body shaking with heat. James returned from outside, wiping sweat off his brow. He had spent the day repairing boundary sensors. Riala ran to him, her face pale with fear. "It's my son," she said. "He's burning up." James didn't hesitate. He rushed inside, knelt beside the child, and placed a hand on the boy's chest. It was like touching fire, as he had water. James asked quickly, "Yes, but he can't keep it down," Riala said, near tears. James looked at the boy, then at her. "We're going to the clinic." "No," Riala said suddenly, stepping in front of him. "They won't help him. Not someone like us. They will." James growled. "Because I won't give them a choice." He grabbed his coat, wrapped the boy gently in a warm blanket, and lifted him into his arms. The child whimpered but didn't cry. Too weak to protest, Riala followed, her heart racing. She had been turned away before, insulted, ignored. She had begged for medicine in other towns and been told, "You people don't belong here." But this time, she wasn't alone. The clinic in the center of the human settlement was cold and bright. White lights buzzed from above as James burst through the doors. A nurse looked up, frowning. "No aliens," she said before he even reached the counter. "He's sick." James shouted, "He needs care now." The nurse stood, arms crossed. "Policy says human patients only. Take him to the outpost on the far ridge. He won't survive the ride." James growled, his voice rising. "I said he needs help now." A security officer stepped in, a hand resting near his belt. "You're disturbing the clinic, sir. Please leave." James looked down at the child in his arms, his face pale. Lips dry, fever rising, he turned back to the staff, eyes burning with fury. "This boy's name is Rollo," he said loudly. "He's innocent. He hasn't stolen, hasn't hurt anyone. He's not an enemy. He's a child." The nurse didn't move. James clenched his jaw, took a deep breath, and did something no one expected. He slammed the emergency button on the counter. Alarms rang out, lights turned red, and a voice shouted. From overhead, emergency protocol activated. A doctor rushed in from the back room, startled. "What's going on?" He shouted. James turned to him, holding the child forward. Patient in critical condition, species irrelevant. You treat him now or I file a war crime complaint under interspecies care codes. The doctor stared at James for a second, then looked at the child. He cursed under his breath, then nodded. Prep a bed, move. He barked to the staff. Riala gasped softly behind James. Holding her hands over her mouth, a few nurses protested. But the doctor silenced them with a sharp glare. Within minutes, the boy was lying on a biobed, machines scanning his vitals. James stood by the door as Riala was allowed to sit beside her son. She stroked his hair gently, whispering in their native language. The doctor returned after some time, pulling off his gloves. He's got a dessert fever strain, nasty, but treatable. He looked at James. Good thing you pushed. He was close to slipping. James nodded silently, but his fists were still clenched. His anger hadn't faded. When he stepped outside the clinic, people stared. A crowd had formed during the chaos. Some whispered, "Why risk so much for an alien brat?" Others shook their heads. He's going to get himself banned from town. James didn't care. He returned later to check on Riala and the boy. The boy was sleeping peacefully now, sweat drying on his forehead. Riala looked up at James with tears in her eyes. "You saved him," she whispered. "No." James said quietly, "You did. You stayed strong. You carried him all this way." Riala touched his arm gently. "I don't know how to thank you." She said, "Don't," James replied. "Just promise me you'll never stay quiet." Again, when your child is sick, she nodded, and, for the first time, her shoulders relaxed just a little, but both of them knew. This act, James demanding help for an alien child, would not go unnoticed by the others. He had made enemies today, powerful ones, but he had also made a promise to himself. As long as Riala and her children stayed under his roof, they would never be turned away again. Not by illness, not by laws, not by anyone. The boy's fever finally broke 2 days later. James sat on the porch that evening, watching the orange sun dip below the rocky hills. The world was quiet for once, but his thoughts weren't. Inside the cabin, Riala sat beside her son, stroking his hair as he slept. Her daughter was curled up next to her, holding Riala's arm like it was her only anchor in the world. James didn't say much that night. He just handed Riala a bowl of warm soup and told her she needed to eat too. She nodded and took it, but her hands trembled later. When the children were asleep, Riala walked slowly to the porch and sat beside James. She looked tired, but something more than that something broken, like a piece of her, had finally snapped. "Thank you," she said in a whisper. "You saved his life. You saved both of them." James nodded, sipping his drink. He didn't need thanks. He just didn't want to see another child buried in silence. But Riala wasn't finished. She turned toward him, eyes lowered, voice tight and trembling. I know they want us gone," she began. "I hear them when I go to the well. When I pass the market, they say you're risking everything by sheltering us." James stayed quiet, letting her speak. "I can't let that happen," she said. "I can't be the reason you lose your land, your life, your peace." She took a breath, then said the words that made James freeze. "My children are well behaved," she whispered. "I can cook, clean, work hard, and I can be a good wife to you, human, if that's what it takes to stay." James turned his head sharply. Shocked, he saw Riala staring at the ground, her cheeks burning with shame. She wasn't offering love or romance or affection. She was offering herself like a bargain, like a final coin to trade for survival. "You don't have to say that," James said, voice low and firm. "Yes, I do," Riala replied, still not meeting his eyes. "Where I come from, a woman without a buff. Husband has no safety, no place to belong. I'm just trying to keep my children alive." She looked up finally, and James saw the tears welling in her eyes. I'm not asking you to love me, she said. I know I'm nothing special, but I can try my best to make you happy. Just don't send us away, please. James sat in silence, his throat tight. He had faced Warlord's death and destruction, but this quiet plea from a broken mother hit harder than anything else. He reached out and gently placed a hand on hers. She flinched at first, then slowly relaxed. Riala, he said softly, you don't have to trade yourself for safety. I don't want that. You and your children are safe here. Not because I expect anything, but because it's right. Her lips parted slightly, as if she didn't understand his words. I don't want a servant, James continued. I don't want a deal. I want you to feel human here, Evan. If you're not, you matter, Riala. You don't owe me anything. Riala covered her mouth with her hands as the tears finally came. She cried without sound, like someone who had trained herself not to be heard, even in pain. James sat beside her, saying nothing more. He let her cry, because sometimes silence was the kindest thing. When she finally wiped her tears, she whispered, "No one's ever told me that before." James smiled gently. First time for everything. That night, Riala didn't return to the far corner of the cabin. She slept near the children, but this time under a proper blanket James had placed. For her, and for the first time, she didn't wake up trembling in the dark. But the world outside was still watching, still whispering, the next morning. A strange mark was burned onto the outer fence of James's property. A circle with a line slashed through it. The settler's sign for unclean. Unwanted traitor. James stood, staring at it. Jaw clenched. Riala joined him, her expression unreadable. They? No, we're not leaving, she said. James nodded. Let them know louder, he said, and painted over the mark with white paint that afternoon. James installed stronger cameras and motion alarms. He added extra locks and began quietly preparing for what he feared might come next. Because he knew kindness had a price, and someone out there wasn't happy that he paid it for her. But when he looked inside and saw Riala helping her daughter draw a flower with charcoal on the wooden floor, and her son chasing one of the cleaning drones, laughing again, he knew it was worth it. Every risk, every warning, every bitter glance, if it meant giving them just one more day of peace. Asterisk, it happened just after midnight. The children were asleep. Riala was dozing beside them, and James sat at the table fixing a broken sensor with tired hands. He heard, at first a strange click, then a faint sizzle. He stood slowly, alert. His sensors hadn't gone off, but something was wrong. Then the smell hit him. Smoke, not from the fire pit, not wood. This was bitter, oily fuel. James rushed to the front door, yanked it open, and flames exploded to life along the fence. Bright, hungry fire crept fast over the dry grass and old wood. It had been set in 3 places at once. Whoever did it had planned it well. Riala woke with a start as the fire alarms screamed. She grabbed both children and ran to the doorway. Eyes wide with fear, "They're trying to burn us out," James said sharply. Grabbing his rifle and slamming the emergency shutters down over the windows, he activated the fire barrier. A humming shield formed a dome around the house, powered by old tech he kept just in case, but it wouldn't last long. Not if the fire reached the fuel drums behind the shed. "Get to the storm shelter," James ordered, pointing to the hatch on the floor. "No, I'm not leaving you," Riala said, clutching her children tightly. "You have to," he said. "That's the safest place right now. Go." Riala obeyed, guiding the children down into the hatch as James stepped out into the smoke. The air burned his throat, but he pushed forward, rifle in hand. Shapes moved near the fire figures in the dark, watching, waiting. "Show yourselves." James shouted, "You think fire scares me?" One figure stepped closer, face hidden under a hood. "You should have turned them in," the voice said coldly. "You were one of us. Now you protect them. You've betrayed your kind, James. Raised his rifle slowly. I protect the innocent. That is my kind. A bottle came flying through the air, glass in flame. James shot at mid-flight, shards raining down like sparks. They were trying to make him afraid, trying to chase Riala and her children back. Into the wild, back into silence. But James wasn't going anywhere. He activated his drone system, and from the roof, 2 defense orbs lifted into the night. They flashed with warning lights and emitted a high-pitched whine as they circled the attackers. The group scattered, some running, some throwing rocks at the drones. James used the moment to grab the fire hose and started blasting the flames. Nearest the fuel drums, inside the shelter, Riala clutched her children tightly. The girl cried silently, and the boy shook like a leaf. Riala whispered prayers in her language. Not for herself, but for the man above who refused to run. After what felt like hours, the fire began to die down. The drones returned, one damaged, the other sparking. James stood in the ash, coughing, his shirt singed and his arms trembling. But the house was still standing. The attackers were gone. No one stayed to fight when the drones marked their faces. James had set them to record. Whoever had come that night would be known. He walked back into the house. Past the scorch marks and shattered fencing, he opened the hatch and looked down at Riala. "It's safe now," he said hoarsely. She climbed out slowly, eyes red, holding her son tightly. When she saw James's hand shaking, she reached for him. "You're hurt," she said. "I'm fine," he whispered. But when she pressed her hand to his cheek, he couldn't hide it. He leaned into her touch, eyes closing for just a second. "You didn't run," she said softly. "No." James answered. "I don't run. Not when people I care about are in danger." She held his hand, and for the first time, didn't pull away that night. The family slept together in the center of the room. No walls between them, no distance, just quiet breathing, soft warmth. And the knowledge that they were still alive. The next morning, James found something by the gate. A single word scratched into the dirt with a boot. "Traitor." He stared at it for a long time, then took his boot and erased it. Riala stepped beside him. Carrying a small piece of bread and a cloth, he took it, nodded, and said, "They're not going to stop. You know that, right?" "I know," she replied, "but neither will you." He looked at Horelli, looked not as a guest, not as a burden, not even as an alien, but as someone who had stood beside him in the fire, and he realized something. He wasn't protecting a stranger anymore. He was protecting family. 3 days after the fire, a patrol ship landed near the settlement. Its engines roared above the hills, dust spinning into the air. James stood on the porch with his rifle resting against the wall, watching it descend. Riala stayed inside with the children, her arms wrapped around them. She knew that sound. She had heard it before when camps were cleared and refugees were dragged away. The ship's door opened, and 3 men in black armor stepped out. Government officials, not from the colony. It's the kind of men who never smiled and always asked questions. Later, James walked down to meet them, his boots crunching over burned earth. One officer raised a scanner, pointing it directly at James's chest. "James Riker," he said, "reading the data, you've been reported for harboring illegal alien refugees and resisting local enforcement." James nodded, calm. "I didn't resist. I protected." "There's a difference." The officer's jaw tightened. "You could be arrested. You've broken multiple colonial regulations." James stepped closer, his voice steady. "Then do it. But know this, if you drag them away, you're leaving behind a mother who nearly died for her children, and 2 kids who finally started smiling again. You'll be the monsters who tore that apart." The second officer glanced at the burned fence, at the security drones barely holding together. "We also found evidence of arson and attempted murder," he said. "Did your neighbors mention that when they reported you?" "No," James said sharply. "They never do. The first officer sighed and looked toward the cabin. Where is the alien woman now? James didn't answer with words. He simply turned and walked back to the house, opening the door wide. Riala stood inside, holding her children, eyes steady but afraid. James reached out his hand and said, "Come here." She walked slowly, still unsure, but she placed her hand in his. He guided her outside, stood beside her, and looked the officers in the eyes. "You want to file charges?" James asked. "Then put them on both of us, because she's not just a guest anymore. She's my wife now." Riala gasped softly and looked up at him in shock. Her lips parted, but no words came. The children stood frozen beside her, blinking. With wide eyes, one of the officers lowered his scanner. "You married her?" he asked, surprised. James nodded. "I give her my name, my protection, and my rights under human law. Now she and her children are part of my family, so you'll have to go through me." The silence stretched for a long moment. Then the second officer tapped a few buttons on his datapad. He checked James's military records, citizenship status, and land ownership. Finally, he said, "As her husband, she's now covered under human sanctuary rights." He looked at the others, then gave a slow nod. "No law broken, just a lot of noise." James let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The lead officer gave one last look, then said, "Keep her safe. But be warned, others may not agree with your decision. I didn't ask for their approval." James replied, "I only care that she's safe." The patrol ship rose into the sky and disappeared beyond the mountains, back inside the cabin. Riala sat on the edge of the bed, still stunned. "You said I'm your wife," she whispered. "You didn't have to." James knelt in front of her, holding both her hands now. "I know I didn't have to, but I wanted to." "Why?" she asked, tears welling in her eyes again. "I have nothing. I'm not human. I'm not beautiful by your standards. I'm broken." James shook his head slowly. "You're strong. You survive things no one should ever face. You love fiercely. You fight for your children like a warrior. You kept going when others gave up." He gently touched her cheek, wiping away a tear. "You're more human than most of the people I've known. You belong here with me." Riala leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, a quiet gesture in her culture, a vow without words. The children watched silently, then crawled into James's lap and hugged him tightly. Not out of fear, but out of love, from that day forward. James repaired the fence not just as a wall but as a line no one would cross again. He built new rooms onto the cabin, one for each child. He carved a symbol above the door to hands. One human, one alien, holding each other when people passed. The house now, they still whispered, but they whispered something new. That's the place where the human married an alien widow. That's the place where he gave her his name. That's the place where family still means something, and every night, under the stars, Riala would sit beside James, her head resting on his shoulder, her heart finally still. Because she wasn't just surviving anymore, she was home.